Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. Again, that's think-liberty.com. And this is episode 13, The Instrument of Growth. And Dylan is not joining me today because Dylan is heading to lovely Hawaii with his lovely wife. And I actually just ran into him at the San Francisco airport. I was returning from a business trip, and he was on a unplanned layover in SFO. So we hung out for an hour or so and had a little chat. Of course, he immediately pulled out Quigley's book, and we started looking into it. And his wife was there as well. She watched online videos while him and I geeked out on Carol Quigley. And like I said, that's why he's not joining us today. But I have here a hand puppet that looks just like Dylan. So he is going to curse and interrupt me whenever needed. And what I want to talk about today is basically just a little addendum to our recent episode. I believe it was episode 10, where we talked about the evolution of civilizations. And just a quick recap. Societies are obviously groups of humans coexisting on land masses, connected through relationships. Societies create instruments to achieve goals such as protection, military, or the regulation of mutual power relations, which is politics, material, monetary wealth, which is economics, companionship, which is social, spiritual enlightenment, which is generally referred to as religion, and of course the pursuit of knowledge, which is intellectual. And a civilization usually goes through 7 stages: gestation, mixture, expansion, conflict, universal empire, decay, and invasion. To achieve goals in these different areas, societies create instruments. Over time, instruments become institutions, meaning their prime focus becomes perpetuating their own existence, status, wealth, etc., rather than the original goal. One such instrument is the instrument of growth. And Quigley says that any society with an instrument of growth is referred to as a civilization. The instrument of growth is essentially a monetary system that facilitates invention, savings, and investment of the savings. And Quigley says that as long as the savings are invested, society grows. And Quigley defines savings as accumulating wealth beyond what's needed for consumption, which kind of makes sense. It's basically any money in excess of consumption. But I want to get into that in a little more detail here. Where do savings come from exactly? From a macroeconomical perspective, savings can come from 3 types of spending: government deficit spending, investment spending, and export surpluses. And why is that so? So in national accounting, we have for example, when the GDP is calculated, national macro accounting, we have an equation that says national income equals consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. Okay? And that makes sense because income is generated from spending. And I think that's pretty important to understand. There is no income unless somebody spends money, right? If I buy apples from Dylan for $50, if I buy, like, let's say it's a bag of apples, then that spending generates income for him. And at the same time, I consume the apples. So in that case, for example, there's no savings generated because I spent $50. If we zoom out, look at the economy from a macro level, then our two-person economy has generated income of $50, which Dylan has earned. But I also have I have spent $50 on consumption. So in total, we don't have any savings generated because there's no savings. There's no income in excess of consumption in the aggregate. So in the macroeconomic accounting equation, savings equal investment spending plus government purchases minus taxes plus net exports. And so I'll explain what's behind this equation a little bit. So if we start from zero, let's say we don't have a monetary economy, we have a subsistence economy. How does money get introduced? We have covered this in episode 1. So if you want to have a detailed a rundown on this, you should listen to Amagi episode 1. But if we start from zero in an economy where, let's say, I'm the tribal chief and I've introduced an economy called, a currency called Nima bucks, then money is initially introduced by a governing body or by a governing authority that imposes a tax and spends money into existence. And some of that money is taxed out of existence. So as we discussed before, the reason why money has value initially or has had value historically initially is because some government imposed a tax in that money. So now people suddenly need it. So they are willing to work for it. So I can hire them into my so-called public sector. If you imagine like some tribal economy where for, a long time, the tribal chiefs have had power for whatever reason, cultural, could be military domination or whatever. They have the authority to impose a tax. And that authority to impose a tax is crucial in introducing a monetary system. Because without the tax, people don't need the money. And if they don't need the money, they don't need to work for the money. So if I impose a tax and I spend some money into existence and then I tax some of that, but not all of it out of existence, then what remains in private hands is saving. So that's the first form of saving that can be generated. It is income earned by the private sector that has not been simultaneously used up for consumption. So by definition, it generates saving, as opposed to my example earlier with the apples. This type of spending, because it is income earned by the private sector, but it's not spent on consumption simultaneously, it generates saving by definition. And also, the next method of generating savings, that same government that I just described, but let's say we've become a little more sophisticated, okay? But still that same government, usually via their lending agents, today we call them the private banks, can also lend money into existence. Because, if you have the authority to tax and spend money into existence, you can also lend money into existence. Historically, lending money into existence has been used to finance investment projects. For example, if a bakery wants to make sandwiches more efficiently, they can take on a loan to buy a sandwich machine. And with that machine, they can make 200 sandwiches per hour instead of 10. So from the increased proceeds, the borrower, the bakery, can now pay off the loan eventually, and the maker of the sandwich machine earns income that once again does not have a consumption counterpart, because a bakery spending money on this type of equipment constitutes what's called investment spending. Investment spending is spending that businesses do on goods and services that are not used up for consumption. They are used in the production process. That's the definition of investment spending. So investment spending generates savings in this example I just gave you, right? It's not the other way around. It's not savings are accumulated and then invested. Investment spending has generated savings. It always generates savings, in fact. Anytime somebody spends on capital goods or other investment goods, then that spending by definition generates savings, because it's, once again, it's income earned that adds to national income, but it's not in that same period consumed. So yes, it does not have a consumption counterpart. So macroeconomically speaking, our monetary economy has once again accumulated savings. Now, of course, the funding for that machine, and this is the I'm going to call this the 2B, where the previous method was method 2A, bank lending. 2B, the funding for the machine could also come from previously generated private sector saving from any of the three methods I mentioned: government deficits, investment spending, or export surpluses. So the funding can, of course, also come from previously generated private sector savings. And in fact, in our modern day economy, that is the most common method to finance very long-term projects, aka common stock financing. And the third method, and I'll get into this a little more later, but the third method of generating savings is through export surpluses. Because an export surplus, once again, generates income that does not get consumed by my economy simultaneously, right? It gets consumed. The consumption spending occurs in some other monetary economy, right? An economy that uses a different currency, but not my currency. So export surplus also generates saving in my economy. So any monetary society historically has always had these three methods at their disposal to generate saving. But without initial spending, there could be no savings. So it's important to understand that spending comes first, and the saving is a result of these different types of spending, at least initially, if you go back to the very origin of the monetary economy. Now, as mentioned earlier, with money accumulated in private sector hands, the private sector itself also has the opportunity to invest that money in capital goods. Or multiple people could, of course, pool their money together and fund very long-term, large capital equipment projects. This has generally been done by investment banks. And this, of course, began in Western civilization on a very large scale with the advent of the railroads, because railroads required huge sums of capital, while traditional commercial banks were more used to short-term funding of raw materials and wage bills. So this would be an example of previous savings begetting investment spending that in turn generates yet more savings. So theoretically, this could go on and on and on, right? And what Quigley is saying is that civilization grows as long as investment spending occurs. And I guess as long as lots of investment spending occurs, which requires for society to be organized for inventiveness. Because without inventiveness, none of this would happen, right? Without inventiveness, all the savings would be generated by government deficit spending, I guess, and maybe by export surpluses. But the capital stock of the economy that you're looking at wouldn't grow much without investment. And so regardless of how many savings are generated out of these other types of spending, such as net exports or government deficits, without inventiveness, there wouldn't be much investment spending. And what exactly creates an inventive society, or what exactly facilitates inventiveness? Well, I think we'll probably get into that in one of our future podcasts. But suffice it to say, for the moment, that without inventiveness, you wouldn't have any investment. You also wouldn't have any savings generated out of investment. So, as I mentioned earlier, investment spending by itself generates more saving and of course, the additional currency that ends up in bank accounts wouldn't be worth much unless a lot is available to purchase in that currency. And how do we make sure that there's a lot available? Because basically, what money gives you is like a ticket to a theater, except the theater is the economy of your country. So, a US dollar is a ticket that gives you access to the theater that is the US economy, to let's say a seat in the theater that is the US economy. And if there's a lot to see in the theater that is the US economy, then that ticket or the dollar is, of course, worth more. So if savings are only generated out of government deficits and or export surpluses, then the country's currency will probably not be worth a whole lot. You won't have a lot of economic growth in the economy itself, and also its currency won't be worth much. So you know, this is where also inflation comes in. You know, if all your spending is just deficit spending and export surpluses, but you don't improve the capital the capital development of the economy, then the currency that you're introducing isn't going to be worth a whole lot. So I think that's just important to understand. Oh, another thing that I want to hone in on here is that there's this belief in certain economic circles that savings and investment are that savings are required for investment, so that investment spending comes once people have accumulated some savings. But that's not necessarily the case, right? Because as you saw earlier in the example I gave, there are ways in which savings are generated from investment spending. So it's actually the other way around. Now, of course, once you have savings, like I said, people can also choose. So it can go one way or the other. People can also then choose to invest the money that they've saved. But without initial spending, there would be no savings. So it's pretty important to understand that spending always comes first. To mobilize resources in any economy to get people to build a bridge, if you're, let's say, or if I'm a tribal leader and I want to build a bridge over some river, let's say, probably it will probably be a very creaky old school bridge, but that doesn't happen unless I decide to impose a tax and direct spending towards that project. And that's how it works in today's economy still in many ways. Without investment spending, or without the decision to spend, resources aren't mobilized. So spending is very instrumental to generating income. And without it, there would be no income generated. And so, like I said, there are these stories about Robinson Crusoe. He eats. He's able to catch 5 fish a day with his bare hands, but then he decides not to catch 5 fish, not to consume, but instead to invest and / save and invest and build a fish net. And then now he can catch 100 fish a day with that fish net. And that's oftentimes used to explain the correlation between investment and savings, and how investment improves the capital stock of the economy, which is true. Investment does do that, but it doesn't really work this way, right? We don't live in a Robinson Crusoe economy, and we never really have. We've never really had economies like that. It generally begins, in my opinion at least, I'm happy to see evidence to the contrary. All the evidence I've seen is it begins with a monetary system, and a monetary system begins with a sovereign government imposing a tax and then spending money into existence. Now, it doesn't have to, of course, like, I gave you this progression earlier from government taxes and deficit spends, and then we get into the government can also lend, and then we have export surplus. I guess it doesn't have to be in that order, but it's a good way of understanding how this works. Of course, we may have had some economies that started with export surpluses that just a monetary economy start with export surpluses. By exporting goods to foreigners, foreigners would give their currency to your central bank or whatever authority would be in charge of that, and then central bank would issue currency against that could then be used in the domestic private sector. So spending generates income, and specifically these three types of spending that I mentioned generate savings. And why do we look at these things, or why is it important? Well, because we want, I guess, to have a lot of capital development in the economy, or at least that's what we've been primed for. As Quigley also talks about in his book, I'm just pulling it up here. It doesn't always have to be that way, right? We are so used in our modern day economy to expand. I'm just going to quote here from Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, page 497. An economic system does not have to be expansive, that is constantly increasing its production of wealth, and it might well be possible for people to be completely happy in a non-expansive economic system if they were accustomed to it. In the 19th century, however, the people of our culture have been living under expansive conditions for generations. Their minds are psychologically adjusted to expansion, and they feel deeply frustrated unless they are better off each year than they were the preceding year. The economic system itself has become organized for expansion, and if it does not expand, it tends to collapse. Okay? And he goes on. The basic reason for this maladjustment is that investment has become an essential part of the system. And if investment falls off, consumers have insufficient incomes to buy the consumer's goods which are being produced in another part of the system, because part of the flow of purchasing power created by the production of goods was diverted from purchasing the goods it had produced into savings. And all the goods produced could not be sold until those savings came back into the market by being invested. In the system as a whole, everyone sought to improve his own position in the short run, but this jeopardized the functioning of the system in the long run. The contrast here is not merely between the individual and the system, but also between the long run and the short run. The 19th century has accepted as one of its basic faiths the theory of the harmony of interests. This held that what was good for the individual was good for society as a whole, and that the general advancement of society could be achieved best if individuals were left free to seek their own individual advantages. This harmony was assumed to exist between one individual and another, between the individual and the group, and between the short run and the long run. In the 19th century, such a theory was perfectly tenable, but in the 20th century, it could be accepted only with considerable modification. As a result of persons seeking their individual advantages, the economic organization of society was so modified that the actions of one such person were very likely to injure his fellows, the society as a whole, and his own long-range advantage. This situation led to such a conflict between theory and practice, between aims and accomplishments, between individuals and groups, that a return to fundamentals in economics became necessary. Unfortunately, such a return was made difficult because of the conflict between interest and principles, and because of the difficulty of finding principles in the extraordinary complexity of 20th century economic life. The factors necessary to achieve economic progress are supplementary to the factors necessary for production. Production requires the organization of knowledge, time, energy, materials, land, labor, and so on. Economic progress requires three additional factors. These are innovation, savings, and investment. Unless a society is organized to provide these three, it will not expand economically. Innovation means devising new and better ways of performing the tasks of production. Saving means refraining from consumption of resources so that they can be mobilized for different purposes. Okay, so he actually uses a very good definition of savings here. And investment means the mobilization of resources into the new, better ways of production. The absence of the third factor, investment, is the most frequent cause of a failure of economic progress. It may be absent even when both of the other factors are working well. So that would be what I said earlier. There could be savings generated out of deficit spending, and there could be savings generated out of export surpluses, but then nobody's investing anything, right? So the absence of the third factor, investment, is the most frequent cause of a failure of economic progress. It may be absent even when both of the other factors are working well. In such a case, the savings accumulated are not applied to innovations, but are spent on consumption, on ostentatious social prestige, on war, on religion, on other non-productive purposes, or even left unspent. So this would be an example where, I guess, the private sector generates savings, but then doesn't invest much of that savings. So doesn't generate more investment, which could, like I said earlier, private sector saving that is invested begets yet more saving, which could then beget more investment, and so on and so forth. But if people choose not to do that, then there's not much progress. So in such case, the savings accumulated are not applied to inventions, but are spent on consumption, on ostentatious social prestige, on war, on religion, on other non-productive. Of course, war would be the government. If the government just spent money into existence and uses it for war, not very productive. On other non-productive purposes, or even left unspent. Economic progress has always involved shifts in productive resources from old methods to new ones. Such shifts, however beneficial to certain groups, and however welcome to people as a whole, were bound to be resisted and resented by other groups who had vested interests in the old ways of doing things and in the old ways of utilizing resources. In a progressive period, these vested interests are unable to defend their vested. In a productive period, these vested interests are unable to defend their vested interests to the point of preventing progress. But obviously, if the groups in a society who control the savings which are necessary for progress are the same vested interests who benefit by the existing way of doing things, they are in a position to defend these vested interests and prevent progress merely by preventing the use of surpluses to finance new inventions. Such a situation is bound to give rise to an economic crisis. From one narrow point of view, the 20th century's economic crisis was a situation of this type. To understand how such a situation could arise, we must examine the development in the chief capitalist countries and discover the causes of the crisis. And then, of course, he goes on and goes into each of the major Western European countries, Great Britain, France, Germany, etc. each of them functioning based on different, qualities and institutionalized routines, etc. But the main point here is that if investment spending falls, then that is generally that generally leads to economic crisis, because then that means that there's that income falls. Okay, if investment spending drops, then there are people in the investment sector are out of money and out of work. Then they won't consume from the consumer sector, and then the consumer sector will have to cut down, and then that sort of spirals unless net exports or government deficits can sort of fill the gap, which is generally, Dylan and I have talked about this with the job guarantee program and similar stabilizing systems. We're libertarians, but the entire monetary system is top-down government imposed. So it's ridiculous to say, well, the private sector is just going to take care of it. No, it won't. It never has. There's no evidence for that historically. But that's just sort of what I wanted to hone on a little bit, because we sort of rushed through this element of expansion in our previous podcast about the evolution of civilizations. And if you have any comments or issues or whatever that you want to tell us about this episode, send us your comments. And otherwise, we will see you next time. I just want to let you know that this has been Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com, and this time not Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, but you can still find him on YouTube and check out his stuff. And we are, as always, graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. Once again, leave us your comments, and we will see you next time.